welcome you to the first session of Never Can Say Goodbye. And I'll tell you more about the series in a bit. This series was co-created by Reimagine and Darnell Lamont Walker in conjunction with his new book. You'll hear more about that soon. I'm going to share my screen now. Hold on one second. For those who don't know, I want to tell you about Reimagine. We're a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community. People of all different backgrounds, people of different races, ages, people of faith, people of no faith, all coming together at events like this one to find solace in a world that feels alienating. We support each other to face adversity, loss, and mortality. And we support those who want to transform life's biggest challenges into purpose, action, and growth. So I'm going to ask all of you, just to get the chat going for a little bit, what do you never want to say goodbye to? Maybe it's the memory of a loved one. Maybe it's a belief or value that you hold dear. Maybe it's sunshine, warm weather, democracy. Put that in the chat. What do you never want to say goodbye to? And while you're doing that, I'm going to share a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to tell you what kind of space this is. It's a space to cultivate compassion for others and for ourselves. Many of us have arrived here with some kind of pain in our hearts, and our hope is that this space is full of empathy, warmth, and understanding. This is a space for bravery. It takes courage to show up for others, especially folks who you don't know. It takes courage to lament and to grieve in public. And with all that's going on in the US and around the world, now more than ever, we need these welcoming and inclusive spaces where it's completely normal to share our emotional and spiritual states of mind. Finally, this space is not perfect. We might fumble, we might falter, we might offend, but we ask for your grace. What kind of space this isn't? It's not about blaming. It's not about imposing belief systems on others. It's not about providing solutions or fixing things. Another thing I want to emphasize is that although this is not a political space, it is a space to cultivate justice. And what is justice? I like this definition from Dr. Cornel West. Quote, justice is what love looks like in public. So it's more than a feeling. Love is a call to action for safety and wholeness. Okay, so what is going to unfold? I'm going to briefly introduce Darnell to you. I'm going to hand this over to him to lead the conversation with our very special guests, JJ Duncan, Bob Haggerty, Michelle Hord, and Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. There may be time at the end for a few questions, so please use the chat. If questions do come up for you, I will try to field those to our speakers at the end. Please note, from February 2nd to April 17th, registrants to this series, Never Can Say Goodbye, will receive a 15% discount on the paperback version of Never Can Say Goodbye. My colleague Nicole Tan will paste a link in the chat for you for that. And now I am delighted to introduce Darnell Lamont Walker. Darnell, we've been working on this series for a long time now, and I'm so thrilled that we're here together. We're here with this amazing group of people. Darnell, if you don't know, he's a writer and he's a death doula. Darnell, can you help define for us what is a death doula?
Oh, absolutely. I always like to talk at the core of it. It's someone who supports a person or an individual or a family at the end of life, whether that's spiritually, emotionally, physically, just someone who supports someone at the end of life.
And you have pointed out that in many ways, we all become death doulas, whether or not we're certified or not, because we're going to have to be present for others, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think I talk about it often, how we have all done this work. I learned how to do this work from my grandmother, who'd never heard the term before in her life. Some of us just look at it as care or love. This is what we do for family. This is what we do for our friends. So we've all done this work on some level, and it's not always, death loss. Sometimes it's the grief of many things that we help people through.
Can you tell us a bit about your grandmother?
Oh, absolutely. I love talking about my about my grandmother. Her name was Irene Elizabeth Jones. She was just the best person in my life, but she was also the community grandmother. She was the one everyone came to, everyone for whatever it was, something as small as being able to use her phone, to her making potato salad for a funeral, or she was always showing up for those who needed her most, who needed the love. She took care of family when others turned their back on them. And so watching her as a kid, I'm watching her do these things and seeing the love that she received. And she saw my curiosity and really fed into that around this work and the work that she did. And the two of us were the two on that side of the family who talked about death, who talked about mortality and what we wanted, what we didn't want. And so when it came time for her to die, I was there for her and was able to give her that permission that we sometimes need to go to this next thing in our life or in our death.
Well, may Irene's memory be a blessing.
Yeah.
Our session today is going to focus on the collective grief surrounding the deaths of public figures and celebrities. Your book focuses on your clients and your family members. Can you let all of us know why you wanted to focus on how the deaths of these luminaries affect us?
No, absolutely. I look at it as a way in, and so often I'm having these conversations with folks who find it difficult or don't know how to start the conversation around death with the people they love. But it's easier when we're talking about celebrity. We're talking about celebrity death because we get to approach it from sort of a collective, as a collective and with others. And so it's sort of I can't talk about my own. I can't talk about, I don't want to think about my mom dying. I don't want to think about my grandmother dying. But I can talk about, and we'll get into it with JJ, especially, Chadwick Boseman. I can talk about Catherine O'Hara. That's our way into these conversations. And then from there, we can kind of ease our way into, okay, but what would you like your ending to be? And ease our way into our own preparations around death. And so I thought this would be a great start, a great way in for so many of us who haven't found a way to go deeper with the people we love. Because I feel like everyone here, or actually not everyone, but a lot of people here are either can easily have these conversations or looking for a way to start it.
Well, thank you, Darnell, for this book. Thank you for co-creating this series with us. I'm going to step out. I'm going to let you bring in our wonderful speakers, okay?
Yeah, right on. Thank you all for joining. Like Andy said, we have some amazing folks here today that I'm so excited to talk about. Some I've shared stages with, some I'm getting to know, and I'm really excited about it. But I do want to start with Mary Frances, since we're talking about what's sort of known as parasocial grief. I would like to ask, we hear the term so often, but it can sometimes feel abstract in a way. So how can you explain parasocial grief in a way that honors how real it feels to people without dismissing it as less than personal loss?
This, in sort of the academic world was discovered when we realized that people really grieve when television characters die. And there was this wait, but that can't be real, surely people didn't actually feel when, that character died. And it turns out they do. And then we also realized it was bigger than that. It was when celebrities died. It was, I was at UCLA when Michael Jackson died. And within hours, the number of flowers placed around the hospital was just phenomenal. And I think it helps to consider the fact that these are real relationships. When you have a relationship with, your child or your parent, a lot of that relationship is internal, isn't it? You're always thinking about them. You're, thinking, oh, I should text them and see if, blah, blah, blah. All that's actually going on inside of you. Our relationships with, Gillian Anderson or Reverend Jesse Jackson, a lot of those relationships, it is internally happening. And that helps us to see why these are real relationships. They stand for something we deeply believe in, or their lyrics say something that's how we want to say it. So they know us in a way that no one else knows us. And those are real relationships. And it represents real grief when we lose them.
My gosh, yeah. I was also in LA at that time, and I remember being at a friend's place that was probably about 3 miles away from the Jackson compound, but you could hear people singing from 3 miles away.
Amazing.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
And so, do you feel that these deaths act as a large-scale grief rehearsal, where people practice mourning in a way that feels safer than their own losses?
I think that's such an interesting way to put it. Grief shows up in so many places in life. Everything that arises eventually dies. And so we have these sort of practicing in lots of ways, but it isn't even really just practicing because the feelings are real, Mm-hmm. So I think of it as we get to share it in a different way because other people are affected while we're affected. So I'm in the UK at the moment. I'm half British, half American. And I happened to be in London when Queen Elizabeth died. And it was stunning. Overnight, all of the shop windows, all the mannequins were dressed in black. All of the TV commentators had black clothes on. There was lines for hours to file around where she was laying in state. And what was fascinating was it was like a throwback to a different era where we had these shared ways of coming together and demonstrating our feelings of grief. The stories that were told about her, coming to my little tiny town and she said something to me, or, I was at the Buckingham Palace for the shared stories and the way that people were able to pay attention to it as a whole nation. No matter how you feel about the Queen, it was this collective outpouring that was rehearsed and practiced. As you said, it was paying attention to it for an intentional collective reason.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Would like to talk with JJ because just about how celebrity deaths can sometimes expand our imaginations around dying and not just living. Because we've shared stages a couple of times, and I just love the stories you share about your son Mason and his journey. But if you could share that, and how Chadwick Boseman played a part in that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so good to see you, Darnell, and and Mary Frances and everybody. I'm so happy for everybody that's joining today. What a great conversation. My son, my oldest child, Mason, was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 9 years old in 2019. And he went through that cancer journey for a total of about 20 months. He passed in November of 2020. And in that time, he was 11 when he passed away. So, he was very aware of what was going on. And so I was, sort of forced into the position of mothering him through his own death, which was nothing I had, on my bingo card for my life. And it was shocking. And one of the things that happened that I think was the most profound, what do I want to call it? A kind of a stepping stone or a foundational place to start those conversations with my child was when Chadwick Boseman died. Now, Mason was a typical little boy in that he loved the Avengers. He was, I mean, a major Avengers fan. He and his friends would dress up in costume to go to the movies. I mean, it was, it was a big part of our life. I mean, I have action figures and lunch boxes and all the things. And he relapsed. He was in maintenance treatment at the beginning of 2020. And then right in the thick of COVID and all the stuff going on, Mason relapsed. And we learned that he had it was a bad situation. His type of leukemia, his age, all the factors were against him. And so we learned he had a 1 in 4 chance of survival. So it was a terrifying time. And we were in and out of the hospital a lot. And he was getting weaker and weaker. I was still in this mode of like, he's not going to die. He's not going to die. He's not going to die. You just are fighting for your child's life. And we were coming home from the hospital in late August of 2020. And I'm getting him set up. He used to stay, my wife and I, we have 2 kids. We have Mason and Madeline, and he used to come in and stay. They have bunk beds in their room. The kids shared a room. And Mason would, at that point, was staying in the mom's room. He loved it. There was a TV. He could play video games. It was like a good place for him to be as he was so sick. So I'm getting him set up in the mom's bed. And we've just gotten home from the hospital, and I'm organizing things. And I look at my phone, and I see a notice that is a announcement that Chadwick Boseman has died. And my immediate reaction was a gasp, because our whole family loved the Black Panther. I mean, it was a big, it was a major character in our lifetimes and in our household. Mason had a Black Panther poster that was signed by Chadwick in his room, hanging on the wall. And so I just gasped and said, "Oh my God, Chadwick Boseman died." And Mason goes, "What?" And because it was a shock. If all of you remember, he had not told the world that he had colon cancer. And so I immediately, as I said it out loud, I sort of had this sixth mom sense of like, uh-oh. And I clicked on it. And sure enough, I saw the word cancer. And I was like, oh no, I don't want to talk about this with him. He can't hear this right now. And so I was regretting immediately that I said it out loud. And Mason said, "Well, Mama, how did he die?" And I decided to just like brush it away. And I was like, "Oh, he was sick." And I'm just like moving around the room, acting like everything's fine, and he saw right through that. And Mason said, "Well, what does it say?" And I said, "He was sick." And he goes, "With what? Cancer?" And so the last thing I wanted was to discuss cancer with my cancer-filled little boy. But he said, "Mama, read it." He's as stubborn as I am. So, I was like, fine. And I read the article. It's an Associated Press, release. And, it says Chadwick Boseman, I think he was 43 years old, whatever his age, in his early 40s, died in his home in Los Angeles, surrounded by his family and friends of colon cancer. And it goes on to tout his career and all this stuff. And I read the article and I jump into this like speedy, now that's a different kind of cancer than you have. You're going to be fine. I don't want this to scare you. And Mason's cool as a cucumber. And he said, "You can do that?" And I said, "Do what?" And he said, "You can die at home." And I was so confused. I go, "Baby, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, if he was that sick, why would they let you be at home? Why wouldn't he be in the hospital?" So there was no escaping the conversation. I had to say, well, okay. So now I'm like, okay, I have to do it. I have to be the mom. And I crawled in bed with him and I go, "Honey, sometimes when there's no more medicine that will work, you can go on something called hospice care. And that means you can have a nurse or helpers help you, feel okay as possible. And you can be at home or in a home-like environment." And he was just mesmerized by the whole thing. But I kept following it up with, "You're going to be fine." Several months later, we had gone through a clinical trial. The cancer kept coming back again and again and again and again. And there was a day in November where we came back from a clinical trial in Houston. We live in Los Angeles. And we went into a doctor's appointment and they sat us down and they spoke to him directly because he's 11 years old by this point. And the doctor said, "Mason, there's no more medicine that will help you." And Mason said, "Does this mean I'm going to die?" And the answer was yes. And it was a brutal moment, you can imagine. We made it home. And he was very pensive, and I was getting him set up again in the mom's bed. And he looked at me and he said, "Mama, I want to die like Chadwick Boseman." And that's how he made it clear that he wanted a home death. And I had been prepared to, just keep fighting. I wasn't ready yet to let that go. And he's my child. And we talked about it, and it opened up the conversation of what he wanted his death to look like. And he indeed died. It was about a week later that he died at home. My wife and I were holding him. It was 3:30 in the morning. And we had the conversation. He wanted to be cremated. He wanted me to keep his ashes until I died. He wanted to give his Chadwick Boseman poster to his best friend, Sam. So I am so grateful to Chadwick Boseman and his family, and that moment of celebrity death that provided a context for us to have a real conversation, whereas I would have never approached the topic, A, B, known how to say it, but this death of a superhero gave him the groundwork to be able to say his wishes. And so I have so much gratitude to Chadwick to this day for this. And because I have to say, Mason had a beautiful death. We had that blessing in the end. And that's why.
That's beautiful. And just the way, it goes back to why I wanted to have this conversation, but just because how celebrity deaths can expand our imaginations around it. And even you talking about this now, I'm sure there are people, like I get it all the time as a death doula, like I can die at home. And, it's not always an 11-year-old kid. It's, 75-year-old men who didn't know that was an option. And now we can have that. And so you've carried, this grief into public spaces and conferences and television. And so what's the cost of that visibility and what makes it worth it?
That's a great question. Oh my gosh. Well, the cost, we'll start there, is, you do open yourself up to some questions that can feel a little like, what? And that's just part of it. But the truth is I do think people need to have the freedom to be able to ask those questions. And that's, and it's not so much questions, it's comments, people just don't know what to say. Right. And so that's something that I have sort of been surprised by, but I have to say it's not so much a cost as it is a blessing for me. I want to say his name. I want to take the story of Mason, and for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction, right? I can't say his story enough to give it to the world enough to have the reaction of the gutting that happened by losing my child. And I know, there are other people here today who've lost a child, and we've all experienced, I'm sure, grief on some level. And to me, that sort of, that reaction of needing to put that amount of love into the world and say his name like that was just it's partly my way of grieving. And I'm a storyteller. Darnell, you and I, that's why we have shared stages, because that's what we do. And I have watched it and had conversations and experiences where people have felt like maybe they had some handrails about how they can grieve as well. I do think these conversations, Mary Frances, your story about people reacting to television characters strikes me so much, because I think that that's a big thing. And I had this memory as you were saying that when I was, 10, 11, probably around Mason's age, my mother used to watch All My Children. Remember that soap opera, All My Children? Loved it. All My Children was on, every day. So when I was home from school, sick or something, I got to watch All My Children. We had a day off. And I remember a scene where a woman had lost her husband and they had kids. And it was a scene about her grieving. And I'm a child watching this. And there was a beach ball. And her husband had blown up that beach ball. And she was holding this beach ball. And she broke down. The actress did a great job. I wish I knew who it was that did it. And she broke down over this beach ball because his breath was in there. And it hit me so hard as a child. And it worried my mother. My mother was like, oh, it's silly. And she was trying to brush it away. But I have thought of that. And there are, I have a chapstick that was Mason's because it was on his lips, and we saved it for him because he had an immune compromise, he was immunocompromised, and it has Mason's name on, and I love that chapstick, and it's a weird thing I've held on to. So it does help us learn to grieve. And so I do think that me being a storyteller, me being comfortable doing that. My wife is not. My wife is kind of the opposite. She likes it's more private, and we thankfully respect each other's differences with it. But I've have had a place to, again, breathe this out loud. And I have found that many, many others are grateful for the handrails.
Yeah, right on. No, just the thought of just when grief becomes public, it helps us so much. I think we are more communal than we sometimes like to admit. And even that story, just the story of his breath being in that beach ball, it reminds me, and Mary Frances talking about the UK, I remember reading a story years ago of this woman who lost her husband, and she would ride the tube because he did the voice of the stops. And then one day she gets on and they had replaced it with an automated system. But then it becomes public information that she lost her husband and what's happened. And so I think at their home stop, they replaced that one stop with his voice. And but just how we all came together and that collective grief of it.
Chills, yeah.
And so just speaking of just collective grief and grief that's made public, I want to invite Michelle in to the conversation to share her story, her grief story first with us.
Yes. I will be thinking about the beach ball as well. We were more young and the restless in my house, but I can totally get it. And I would have been out on the floor like this young lady that I was. I, at the age of 39, was blessed to give birth to a beautiful little girl, Gabrielle. Her picture, I can never tell where I am. The pictures are over there behind me. And she was effervescent. She was bubbly. It was like her feet didn't touch the ground. And when she was 6 years old, I decided to get a divorce, in part because I wanted, her to see me demonstrate what I told her love was and how women should be treated. And so I started the process. And for anyone who has, gone through a divorce or knows someone who has, it is a trauma and a grieving process that I think is really swept under the rug to a great deal. Not the death of a legal entity, but of our ideas of what our life would be like, our ideas of perhaps who this other person was, because people can change dramatically during that process. And so after going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for months, my then husband said, "I'll sign the papers." And I met him at a UPS to sign the papers. And he said, "I'm sorry for everything that's happened," because he had made it as difficult and complicated as possible. And I felt this relief wash over me because I'd known him since I was in my early 20s. He was my brother's RA in college. We were really good friends first. And I said, "Listen, we are good friends. That doesn't change. We both love our girl. And all that matters is that we are co-parenting our girl. We're both still her parents." And I went home and I'd moved out of the house because things were so difficult, and called a bunch of people, a bunch of my prayer warriors to say, these prayers have been answered. And I slept well for the first time in a long time. And then midday the next day, I got a call from Gabrielle's nanny. And her voice was hysterical. I couldn't quite understand her, but it was clear something had happened. And, after some frantic moments and a painful long drive in Manhattan traffic back home to New Rochelle, New York, I discovered that my husband had killed our daughter and was in custody. My first job was at America's Most Wanted doing missing children stories when I was in my 20s. And I so remember my boss saying, "Kid, it's such a good thing that you're not married and don't have kids with this job." And I remember being so taken when I would sit in living rooms with people who did not know where their children were or who had just found out the worst, and how they were just literally still sitting or standing or talking or able to brush the hair of the child that was there. And that somehow, despite everything that was going on around them, that they found a way to keep going. And so to, many years later, wind up on the other side of that police tape certainly was, nothing worse than my worst nightmare.
Right on. Thank you for sharing that story. Because it became so public, right? What happens, or what happened to your grief when it became so public, and when others felt so entitled to witness it and to comment on that and to interpret it for themselves? How did that impact you?
I think that the best and the worst occupation I could have had was someone who had lived as a television producer and a news producer, because my ability to talk about things mistakenly gave people the impression that I was good, that it was almost like some third party that they were talking to. And at times I'd have to say, this was my baby. This was my girl. The fact that I'm not in a puddle in front of you does not take away from the fact that this was my child that this happened to. And because I, like JJ, am a storyteller for a living, I was determined to tell her story. I was determined that her story was not going to be what happened to her, that it was going to be who she was. And so very early on, I did everything I could to honor her, whether that was speaking and giving her obituary that I wrote at her funeral, starting a nonprofit in her memory that we still have, 8 years later, called Gabrielle's Wings. But, I don't take for granted the gift to be able to articulate your feelings. I know that everyone does not have that. And I know, because I believe in a higher power, that I was gifted with that. I was not gifted with the ability to make pancakes or to draw. So there's that, we all have our stuff. But, I would get into these weird places where I'm at the Starbucks and I hear people whispering. Or I would meet someone and I could tell they recognized me even though I didn't know who they were. Or people would ask the first or second question and then they would get to something gruesome like, well, how did he do it? And, our macabre fascination with true crime and, all the podcasts, and I'm not downing anyone that's into that, but when you've lived a version of that, it is not a story for you. And, at times I would say, you know what, if that's important to you, it's, Google me. I'm sure you can find it. So, I think it meant a lot of things. And it still does, the way I show up in new spaces, with new people, I carry her with me literally and figuratively everywhere I go. I was blessed in October of 2024 to have a little boy, that's him over there, who looks a great deal like his big sister. And so I have both of their pictures on my phones. And now I'm at a place where, as a script, which you have to develop when you lose someone, what are you willing to say? What are you comfortable saying that feels safe? People see them on the phone. I've sort of lately been wrestling with, so what do I want my script to be now? Because I still honor her. I'm still Gabrielle's mother. So that's, I think during different stages and places, you find different ways to talk about it, to honor it. And they're all right for that moment.
And I imagine that it's in that honoring, at least partly, that you find ways to protect yourself and protect your grief.
Yes. Yes. It's funny. I was blessed to remarry several years ago. And like I said, have our little boy, Alexander. But my husband, as he started to get to know me and would see me around other people, said, it's fascinating to me how often you comfort other people when they learn about your tragedy. And, it's almost like I see the train crash. I see the derailment happening that they don't see, that they're just one question away. And, my instinct is to somehow tell them it's okay. And that frankly isn't okay for me, right? Like that, I don't owe them that. And, I have to remind myself still that, like, full stop. You don't have to say anything else. You can leave the information on the floor and they can run away or they can pick it up. You're not responsible for how they process it. So that's another ongoing thing.
Absolutely. And JJ, I see you nodding your head. Like, would you? Is that a very similar situation you find yourself in often?
Yeah, very much so. I really do recognize a lot of that, and it is the many things you've said, Michelle. Like, people thinking you're okay, and because I dark humor is one of my best tools of life. I've always had it, but like now it's like it has saved me. And Mason had it too, and so it is sometimes funny to me that people are like, well, now that it's been 5 years, and it's like. Right. Those kind of things. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and there's been a new stage since I've had my son where it's like, okay, 1 for 1, no one says that, but it's almost as if people are like, well, you have another, isn't this great? It's over. It's like, it's never going to be over.
The worst words are at least.
Yeah.
At least you have a daughter is what I'm told. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. It's yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. So I want to welcome Bob into the conversation. And I'm a huge fan as someone who hates bad obituaries and loves the good ones. And so I'll let you tell your story, Bob, if you could, or what you do, and introduce yourself to the folks before I go too deep into it and jump ahead of you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I write obituaries for a living. I've been doing this for about 10 years. I figure I've written over 1,000 of them. And very interesting for me to hear you talk about the stories of Mason and Gabrielle, because it's so important that there are stories about them. People always, when I tell people I'm an obituary writer, a lot of people say, I really enjoy reading obituaries. I know that's kind of morbid. And I say, no, it's not morbid. Obituaries are not about death. They're about life. And death is just the pretext for telling those stories. But we have to have those stories. And we often lose those stories because nobody has written them down or recorded them in any way during a person's life. I often, you'll see a lot of obituaries, and you talked about good ones and bad ones. The bad ones are really the ones written in haste. And if there's a celebrity, the obituary will just say he or she died here or there. And then there will be about 8 reactions from other famous people. And they're all completely predictable. Mm-hmm. And then pretty much that's the end of the story. Maybe you get a little bit of Wikipedia style summary at the end of the life. The good ones are where you really tell stories about what made these people who they were, what it was like to be around them, what they were trying to do with their life, and why, and how that worked out. So I often write obituaries in advance when possible, while people are still around. I just interviewed somebody today who was dying of cancer and agreed to talk to me. And what I'm looking for are those stories that we can say. And I think that they are so comforting. The fact my mother died last September, and I was very comforted that we have a lot of stories about her, and we told those and we laughed. And that kind of reassured us that she was still with us and she was going to stay with us as long as we remembered those stories.
No, I love that. Thank you. And since you touched on your mom, she became kind of an unexpected public figure herself. After her review of the Olive Garden went viral, correct? Could you talk about that a bit, or?
Yeah, but it's hard to explain. But my mom worked for a newspaper in a small town in North Dakota, and she was very popular with the local readers. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she did, among many others, was write about new restaurants that came to town. And she never really criticized them. She just told people what they were like, how much it would cost, what was the most popular item, etc. Mm-hmm. And when Olive Garden came to my town of Grand Forks, North Dakota, this was 10 or 12 years ago, my mom wrote about it, and somehow her review of the Olive Garden went viral on the internet because bloggers saw it and they thought it was so hilarious that this grandmother in North Dakota could write a positive, unironic story about a restaurant where no food snob would ever eat. And so new journalists started calling my mom from all over, from New York, from Minneapolis, even from Fargo. And they were all saying, how do you feel about being mocked all over the internet? And my mom said, well, I've got my column to finish for tomorrow, and then I'm going to Bridge Club. So I don't have time to read all of this crap. And that is when my mom went viral, because people loved her reaction. And she was invited to be on all kinds of national TV shows. She met Tony Bourdain, and he arranged to have a book of her reviews published. And she stayed famous for the rest of her life. And when she died, her obituary was on the front page of the New York Times.
I love that. I love that so much.
I mean, there were stories about my mom, thank goodness. Not everybody has a story quite that bizarre, but everybody has good stories. Mm-hmm. And we want to preserve those because they're going to be an important part of our grieving process and our coping process.
And after, you've written over 1,000 obituaries and had that sort of proximity to death, what surprises you most about how people are remembered?
What surprises me most is usually when I'm writing about somebody, I talk to, if possible, the adult children of the person who just died. Mm-hmm. And these survivors are always they care so much that their loved one's story will be remembered. But they also know so little about that story. So what surprises me, what doesn't surprise me anymore, but worries me, is that too often we lose these stories. And so that's why I'm always urging people to try to tell their own stories while they can. And the rest of us have to encourage people to tell their stories and make sure to write those down.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who are here today, I'm big on getting people to start writing these stories down as soon as possible without, many of us are seemingly going to be around a while. We shouldn't wait till there's a threat or, whatever that is. What's the best way for someone to get started telling that story? Is it being interviewed by someone or what? How can they get started now writing that?
Yeah, I think the best way to get started is just to start and not worry too much about where you're going with it. Mm-hmm. People think, how would I tell my story? What is my message? Where would I start? You don't really need to worry about any of those things. You should just start by writing down some things you think are important, stories you like to tell, things you think are important, lessons you've learned. And then one thing will lead to another in your memory, and you'll probably add things. But you just get started, write it. Don't worry about the final shape it will take. Don't worry about misspelling something or violating a grammatical rule. Don't worry about the fact that you probably never completely finish it. Now, some people will never do this. So in that case, we do have to interview them. And most people don't have a lot of experience interviewing. So I tell them, when you interview the loved one, it's not enough just to ask the question and write down the response and go to the next question. Because when you ask a question, people usually don't really answer it the first time. They may go off and tell you something else very interesting. And so you write that down, but then you have to bring them back and say, but what about this? Why did you do that? And sometimes you have to ask quite a few times before you can get whatever they can say. And the other thing to remember is you're not writing for yourself alone. You're writing for people maybe 2 generations from now. And so they're going to need more context to explain what is being said here. Who are these people we're talking about? Where were these places? Why did people do this or that?
Yeah. Have you started yours? Is yours written?
Yeah, I've got about 50,000 words, but basically I know where but I'm following my advice. I just put down stuff, and I'm intending to edit and try to shape it at some point. But at least I've got something written down, so if my kids ever wonder why I did some of the crazy things I did, they'll have my explanation.
No, right on. I appreciate that. Thank you. I want to pull it back to Mary Frances, going back into the celebrity part of it all. So do you think that the frequency and intimacy of access, like following someone, let's say on social media, right? We're all scrolling all day on there. Do you think that changes the depth of grief when a person dies? Does it make it more complicated?
I think that social media gives us ways into a person's life that we wouldn't have had before. I mean, we've always had, sort of tabloids but we have access to actors and musicians now in a way that we didn't always have. And I think we sometimes, Mary Oliver, the poet, who will put things up on Instagram, or I think there's a way in which when someone is able to express themselves, but we discover that it's actually expressing something we're experiencing, that there's that connection that's created. So I think that when we lose someone who is a celebrity and people think, why are you so upset about this? It is in part because you're losing a part of yourself. Either this was, the raging argument between whether Prince or Michael Jackson was better, in high school. I'm dating myself a little here, but, where you listened to every lyric and you waited for every album and you danced and you drank too much or whatever, you are losing that piece of your life. You're losing those connections that you had with your peers because of that music. And yeah, like I say, you're losing a way to express something that you didn't even know how to express before when that person dies. And that can be true of a politician, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, you may have connected with an ideal that you didn't even know was being modeled for you, that suddenly opened up a possibility, modeling who you could be in a world you didn't even know existed, to be able to connect with that part of yourself because of this person. And then when that person dies, you have to reflect, I feel like I've lost part of that connection with the world, that connection with a part of myself. And I think these are the real reasons we have real grief.
No, absolutely. And, it goes into, I think often about folks I talk to who often get embarrassed even by the grief they have for, when people they follow or celebrities they really love die. Because they're like, this doesn't feel rational. And but it's very human, right?
And I think, we judge each other, right? Mm-hmm. Like grief is such a moment for judgment. And I think one of the other things I'm really touched by is the way that if you come from a community where you don't look like, the majority population, if somebody, I think many of us, the summer that George Floyd died, suddenly understood there were people reacting to it because he did look like their brother. He was their uncle. And there was clearly a grief, an outpouring of grief for this person who was not public before. Yeah. Because the connection was a kinship that some people just automatically felt, and others, I think, looked at that and thought, what is happening here? So I think that potential for judgment instead could be the potential for curiosity and asking why. I learned so much over that summer watching my friends respond, and I think it's another way. They weren't celebrities before, but how that brings us in, or can bring us in.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And JJ, just thinking about talking about these deaths with children, what responsibilities for you do you think we carry when having these conversations with kids? Um,
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, honesty and bravery.
mhm,
My instinct at first was I didn't want to talk about it with him because I didn't want to scare him, and that was at the forefront. But right behind that was I didn't want to scare me.
mhm,
And so, and there were that year, I'm thinking back to George Floyd and all that year, God, at the beginning of 2020, Kobe Bryant died in the helicopter crash with his daughter. And Mason was very kind of like obsessed with all of that. I think it was, someone that he knew that died and the daughter died and they died together. And so he really wanted to talk about it. And I didn't want to talk about it. I'll be honest. I was like, I mean, I was sad by it and thought it was awful and terrifying. And I was mad that they flew a helicopter during the weather that was, the cloudy weather. But the idea of sharing that kind of feeling with my child felt scary. And yet, Mason and I had a policy that I was going to be honest with him. And
yeah.
because in the beginning, I didn't want to say the word cancer to him. And then he heard a doctor walk into the room. It was like 2 weeks in when he first got diagnosed and said cancer, and Mason goes, I have cancer. I mean, that was how he found out. And that was me trying to be protective and choose the moment to talk about it and be very like careful. And the
Mhm.
truth is we can't bubble wrap our kids from what real life is any more than we can bubble wrap ourselves from it. And so I think that a celebrity death does bring into play like an opportunity, if anything. Even a safe opportunity. It's actually, I don't know why I couldn't realize that at first, but maybe because he was in the thick of cancer. But Mary Frances, to what you're saying about it becoming a part of our own lives that we represent. I'm at the older I get, I'm in these spaces now where and I'm sure so many of us have had this experience where I look at a photograph and I'm like, God, everyone in that photograph is dead now.
Mhm.
And it's people in my family, it's pets, it's my child. I mean, and it messes with me in a way that I really think there's a lot of it besides just the grief and the loss that is a time marker of my own mortality. And so as Rob Reiner dies, Catherine O'Hara dies. I mean, Reverend Jesse Jackson. I grew up in Atlanta, so like all of those things to me are my own life ticking by, and it is a moment for me to just kind of breathe in the fact that I'm going to die. I'm going to
Mhm.
die, and that's something that can be, kind of a jagged pill to swallow until you get used to it. And then it becomes weirdly, now it's something I want to talk about because Mason taught me. And these, celebrities teach us.
They do. What do you do with that? What do you do with there's this belief that if we face our mortality so many times a day, we live a better life.
Yeah.
What do you do with that realization that, oh yeah, this was going to happen to me? What do you do with that?
That's a great question. I have a practice where it's been a long journey to get here, so I'm going to try to condense this. My higher power is very much represented by reality. God is reality to me. Um, and it's not always pleasant. I spent a lot of my life wanting to escape wherever I was in the moment,
Mhm.
in all the different ways one can. And I still do that. I think it's a natural, even scrolling, something just to escape but when I get very present and I put, there's the exercise of taking in each of your five senses. What can I see? What can I taste? What can I touch? What can I smell? To just put yourself in reality for the moment. When I consider my own mortality, I used to have that app. There was an app that would pop up like a thing 5 times a day at random
Mhm.
times and say, remember you're going to die.
Mhm.
Um, I would be, in the middle of work or something, and it would say, "Remember, you're going to die." And I do that in that moment. I stop and I'm in reality for a moment, and I'm grateful for that. And it's not always reality doesn't mean it's like woohoo. It's
Yeah.
usually very mundane, and being in a mundane place can be a very hard place to be. But when it brings a gratitude for myself and it starts to help me really take in my environment.
No, I love that. I talk about it in my book, but and I've spoken about it very publicly. But when I was 22, I was diagnosed with the blood clotting disorder, and so and at 22, I was told, you should have been dead a month ago. And now I take a blood thinner every day, and so every day I face this mortality. But it's never scared me. It's just pushed me into this thought of, oh, let me honor this moment for a second. And I usually find myself just in somewhere random taking this pill or whatever. But it's like maybe it's something as small as, oh, I should call someone that I haven't talked to in a while. Eat the dessert first, that that type of thing. And it doesn't have to be this grand thing where I write my memoir, but it could be just as small as having ice cream tonight.
Exactly.
So just honoring that. Yeah, I love that. And for Michelle, as someone whose personal tragedy became so public, how do you understand the difference between public mourning and intimate grief now?
I put in the chat a article I wrote for Oprah Daily after Rob Reiner died, because when their other two children released the statement and asked for humanity, that was something I could definitely relate to, because people can get so caught up in the celebrity. And I think sometimes because the stories are so scary, people kind of have to separate themselves. It couldn't happen here, right? Anyone that's ever worked as a news reporter, the first thing that happens when you stick a microphone in front of someone's face at any horrible tragedy is this doesn't happen here. And I certainly could say that as a mom about what happened to me. So there's something about people's ability, whether it's because this celebrity, they met at a certain time in their lives, or the circumstances, a troubled marriage or illness just really hit close to home, that are an opportunity that a lot of times we don't take to pause and take that pill, so to speak. My mom died 32 years ago today of a cerebral aneurysm at 50. I was 24. And her mom died of cancer 3 months later. And my mom was so protective. So like, I'm such a Gen Xer, I can complain all day. But, like the first funeral I went to was my mom's because she was protecting us from everything. And she used to say, nothing is life and death but life and death. And it kind of sounds like a Yogi Berra saying, but it's true. And there are those moments, if we live to 85, I think it's 1,024 months, right? Like there are those moments just to remind yourself when the traffic's making you crazy, the waiter's too slow, like it's only life and death. That's really it. And so, my hope is when I talk about Gabrielle and talk about my own grief, is that I'm using those months wisely, hopefully honoring her, but also honoring my journey and hopefully helping give tools to others who are on that journey.
Yeah, thank you for that. And since we are talking about public loss and celebrity death, who is there a public figure or celebrity whose death devastated you? Or like I was at a death cafe the night before Inwell actually this year, and we all had to get a name tag, and instead of writing our name, we wrote whose death impacted us most. And there were a lot of Prince. There was a lot of Prince in there. Yeah. Yeah.
Classes.
But who for each of you? This question goes to each of you and the audience as well. So if you're listening, go ahead and write it in the chat. I think some of you may have already, but I'd love to know.
For me, it was Prince. I didn't bury the lead there, but what was so interesting for me at the moment, I remember exactly where I was when Michael Jackson died because I was 9 months pregnant and my feet were the size of an elephant and I was waddling down West 72nd Street in Manhattan, and this hush literally felt like it was over the Upper West Side. And when Prince died, I was facilitating this small group of folks, and I saw all of a sudden, like it looked like 1,000 tweets and messages just popped up because everyone that knew me knew that I loved Prince. I'd gone to 17 Prince concerts, And so there was one, people identifying Prince with me, people that knew me, right? There was that. And then there was this, age moment where this young man who was probably 22 said to me after, because I literally stopped and I was like, okay, I'm sorry, but Prince just died. Like I couldn't even keep going. I had to stop.
Hmm.
And this young man came up to me afterwards and he's like, that was really great. I'm really sorry that Prince died. And, he probably didn't know one song, right? That so for
Yeah.
him, it's so personal, right? It's so generation. It's so how you grew up, where you grew up. And, I think the other thing that doesn't get talked about enough is the beauty in a world where we're so isolated in sharing common experiences.
Hmm.
Even if it's a collective grief, there's still beauty in that emotion that gets shared. And we're so polarized and so separated to
Yeah.
also remember that the ability to share those moments, even if they're painful, is beautiful too.
Oh, wow. Yes. Yes.
Darnell, this is
Absolutely.
such a good question, and I would just offer that it's a great way to start a conversation. I mean, this is exactly what you've done today,
Great
right?
way
Is
in.
bring us together.
Great.
And just by saying that, it's not an offensive question. It's people can answer it whatever way they want, but it brings up all sorts of. I think for me, it was Robin Williams,
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah.
where I suddenly was like, oh, I get what's going on here in a
Yeah.
way that, if it had been 10 years earlier, I wouldn't have understood what was going on. I would have thought, this is so weird. What?
Hmm.
And I think it felt so, you just really understood his work. Suddenly, I did in this like kaleidoscoped way, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think mine, it's hard. I'm sitting here going through all the public deaths, and there've been a lot. I mean, Prince, absolutely. I mean, David Bowie. Um, the right now, it's just kind of hovering. Both Rob Reiner and Catherine O'Hara. They were both so unexpected, and it's I think it's the unexpected deaths. It's the ones that they're too young to go, and those are Robert Duvall died the other day, and I was like, oh, he's great. Was he still alive? And that didn't. I don't
Hmm.
mean that in a disrespectful way.
Hmm.
He's been I'm sure retired for many years now. So, but it's funny. Catherine O'Hara was an audible gasp from me when I saw it pop up. So
Right on. How about you, Bob? If
Uh,
any.
I could,
If any.
I could say maybe Princess Diana because it was just such a shocking manner of death. It just seemed unbelievable. And the other one would be again Prince. That really struck me because the Wall Street Journal sent me to fly from Pittsburgh to Minneapolis to go report on his death and try to figure out how and why he died. But I was so struck by meeting people who had driven hundreds or thousands of miles to Minneapolis just to go stand outside his house and leave messages. And somebody who left a note out on the gate saying, Prince, please ask God how my dog Barney is doing in heaven. Um, it was such a collective gathering
Hmm.
that it really struck me and it stayed with me.
Yeah. And I love what you said, Michelle, too, about the things we have in common and how this brings us together. I remember being in, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was leaving a club in Hollywood, and this guy was sitting on the curb, just looking, staring at his phone, but you could tell something was wrong. And I just looked down, I was like, "Oh, are you all right?" He's like, he just looks up and he's like, "David Bowie died." And I'm like, "What?" And then we just sit, I sit right next to him, and we're sitting there for like 20 minutes. And it shocked me how impacted I was by David Bowie's death. Um, yeah, I mean, it was just like, oh, but there have been so Robin Williams, of course, and Diane Keaton is what I wrote on my
Mm.
name tag because that was, I don't like, it was again another shock. I was like, oh, and then I thought about The Godfather and First Wives Club, and I'm like, oh God. And then me and my friends start singing, you don't own me, and so. Yeah, but it is a great way in for anyone who's listening. I know we only have a few moments left, so I want to thank you all for this conversation as we open it up. If there are questions,
There are, Dardell. There's one question that I found from Cherie. She asked, this may be slightly off topic, but do any of you see signs that your loved one is around? And I thought that was, and Cherie thinks maybe this has nothing to do with this topic, but I think it has everything to do with this topic
Mhm.
because we see signs of those celebrities and public figures everywhere. They're so easily accessible. If we go on YouTube, if we're thinking about someone, we go on Spotify if we're missing this musician, but perhaps that's less accessible for the people who we have that direct relationship with.
Yeah.
And we're looking for things. Like I'm curious what all of you have to say about that.
Okay.
Well, someone mentioned Princess Diana, and I immediately thought of my mother and had a moment because I remembered us watching the wedding together, and my mom wasn't alive when Princess Diana died. So I think there's that as well, of things that take you back to your own personal grief. If it's a song, if it's a movie, if it's a face. So that for me is how I articulate that.
I will say that Mason was a chatterbox. He talked all the time. The only time he was not talking is when he went to sleep. And you could tell he'd like be driving in the back seat, blah, 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 blah. And then if it was quiet, I was like, yep, sure enough, he'd passed out in the back seat, right? He was that kind of kid. And when he was dying, because we had that conversation, we agreed that we were going to try to communicate with one another. And I have to say, Mason is a chatterbox in death too. I have signs all the time. And, I don't know, whether that crosses belief systems or what have you, but I doubted my own self. Even though we had that conversation, I actually was, when they started happening, I was like, okay, you're a grieving mom, chill out. But it's been incredible. It's been an incredible journey. And I've had other people reach out and say things. It's really, I have really come to understand a lot more, that we don't know. I do think consciousness is fundamental, and it's something that blows my mind all the time.
No, I love that. For me, like I'm here for that 100%, JJ. For me, I remember wanting so badly to see my grandmother. I would feel these spirits all often. And I write about it too in the book. But and I just kept, I want my grandmother to come. I want my grandmother to come. And uh, this voice just said, she's not going to come. But look over on the desk, and over on the desk was a huge grapefruit that I had for days. And for some reason, I just never ate it. And I would look at it every day and say, I should eat this grapefruit. I never ate it. And I look at the grapefruit and I just burst into tears. And I just thought like, oh, when we miss people, we collect pieces of them even unknowingly. And my grandmother was the person, not the first, but the person I would always eat grapefruit with. We'd cut it a certain way. We'd put some sugar on it. And it was like, she's always been here. You've collected her, and she's around, And so, yeah, I absolutely, I believe in the signs. I see the signs often. Mhm.
Mary Frances, does the scientist believe in signs?
This is such an interesting, it's such an interesting question for me because I, and I don't know what people will think of this, so this is just me being honest, but I think that when we love someone, our brain is shaped by them. Literally, it's shaped in the neural connections, it's shaped in the way the proteins are folded and the neurochemicals and everything. And I see the world through a brain that was shaped by my mother, who died when I was 25. And I see her every time I look in the mirror because I look just like she did. Especially now as I age, I suddenly look like her because this was the age I knew her. And so for me, I don't even have to ask the question if they're signs in some metaphysical way. They're signs, they're right there. And I think it works for me that I am seeing the world through a brain that they shaped, you know?
Thank you so much. Mary Frances, I totally related to that last comment. I usually get up in the morning, I go to the bathroom, I look at the mirror and I say to myself, what is my dead dad doing in the bathroom with me at this moment? Um, Darnell, thank you so much for kicking this series off with this excellent conversation. Mary Frances O'Connor, JJ Duncan, Michelle Hord, Bob Haggerty. Thank you so much for your wisdom, your vulnerability, your insights. Everyone will get a follow-up email with links to their websites, their books. I'm just going to quickly share some announcements with the time that we have left. Let me get this going. Um, if you enjoyed this, please come to the next two sessions of Never Can Say Goodbye. You can RSVP now on our website. There's one on March 25th, and we also have one on April 15th. This session on March 25th will focus on medical aid in dying. I live in New York. This has become a very hot topic now for us as our governor has signed this into law. After years of trying to make this happen, it will be a very interesting conversation. And then our session in April will focus on justice and equity at end of life. That is a theme that runs through all of Darnell's books, so please join us for that. You can register for all these events with the link that Nicole will be pasting in the chat. And there's also a link for all of you to collaborate with Reimagine. You can host your own event. You can share your own resources using our platform. There's more information on that. I also want to let you all know about this interesting opportunity for all of you. Over the years, we've received feedback that you have an experience like this virtually in community with folks, and you want to stay connected and you want to keep it going. That's why we're inviting you to this new online tool that we're developing at Reimagine. It's our growth journey platform. It's technology for healing and growth instead of the toxic behavior that we see on other social media platforms. It is rooted in a body of psychological research called post-traumatic growth that might be of interest to you. On the platform, you can take journeys from grief to growth. You can control what you want to share and what you don't want to share. It's entirely up to you. So there is going to be a link that Nicole will paste in the chat for you to fill out a survey. We hope you can do that now if you're willing to, while we still have time. If you have to go, you got to go. But in the survey, there's an opportunity for you to request access to our platform for you to be a beta tester of it. We really would appreciate your feedback on this. I think that is all we have for now. I'm going to stop sharing. Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the robust chat. Folks were already sharing their celebrities and their public figures that really gutted them. And I hope to see you all with Darnell next month. Have a wonderful the rest of your day. And thanks again. Goodbye, everybody.